Hello, everybody. My name is Moira Meehan, and today I'll be talking about how we can use science to save birds from window collisions. So before we get started today, I just wanted to give a brief overview of today's talk, just so everybody knows what to expect. To start out, in the introduction, I'll give some context regarding bird decline as a whole, and I'll talk about some of the specific issues that birds face. In the background, I'll tell you about the concepts that inspired my hypothesis and how those informed my experimental design. In the method section, I'll explain my research question and I'll show you what my experiment actually looks like. And then after that, I'll tell you about my predictions and explain how the results of my study could be implemented in the real world. And then lastly, I'll summarize the main takeaway points and tell you a little bit about what you can do to help birds. In 2019, a paper was published that made waves in the scientific community and beyond. I wouldn't be surprised if many of you have heard about this either on the radio or from an article on Facebook. But the results showed that there had been a 25% loss in bird populations since 1970 in North America. And that translates to 3 billion birds lost. This statistic by itself is pretty alarming, but it doesn't tell the whole story. Different populations of birds in different habitats actually saw different changes in overall population. For example, in the wetlands, there was actually a slight increase, and this is probably due to all the conservation efforts we've put towards those habitats. On the other end of the spectrum, birds in grassland areas saw by far the most severe decline, almost 53%. And this is maybe due to climate change, changes in land use, and pesticides. Um, but it really varies between groups. Bird enthusiasts have been noticing this trend, this decline in birds, but this study finally had the numbers to back up this observation. So, why does this matter? Why should we care? I think many would agree that birds have their own intrinsic value, but unfortunately, that won't do a lot to convince policymakers to make any meaningful change. Luckily, birds provide a number of ecosystem services and economic benefits. For example, birds are bioindicators. They're very widespread and they're very easy to observe. So, by looking at their populations, we can get a good idea as to the health of their habitat. Additionally, we can observe birds to see how climate change is affecting the timing of biological events. As we look at shifting temperatures, we're also starting to notice changes in when birds are migrating. Birds are a key part of plant life cycles. They are pollinators and they disperse seeds. They're also an important part of many food chains. They consume a lot of insects, and they themselves are important food sources for many other organisms. They also have a direct benefit economically. Just a couple examples. One would be ecotourism. You know, people fly in from far and wide and pay money to observe birds in the wild. Also, birds decrease the pest load on crops. So when birds are doing well, it actually saves farmers money. There are a wide variety of human-caused issues that are likely contributing to bird decline. Some of the more big picture indirect causes would be climate change and habitat loss, while some of the more direct causes that have to do with day-to-day human activity that's negatively impacting birds would be things like pesticides, feral cats, and collisions with structures, which is what we'll be focusing on for the rest of today. With those indirect and large scale problems, it will likely take many years to resolve those. And we should, but it's going to take time and a lot of effort. With those more direct causes, on the other hand, there's things we can do to start fixing those problems now, which I think that's kind of hopeful ultimately. So collisions are a major source of mortality. Here on the screen, you'll see estimates for annual collision mortality in North America for a variety of different kinds of structures. These are just estimates, but many researchers think that these are um, underestimates and the actual number of collisions could be much higher. But regardless of the specific numbers, collisions are a pretty clear-cut case of bird and human conflict. Um, Out of all of these categories, as you can see, building collisions are the worst. And an interesting side note, skyscrapers and urban high-rises tend to get a bad rap when it comes to killing birds, but cities are actually not the main source of building collisions. It's residences, it's houses and low-rises. Because an individual skyscraper might kill more birds than one house, but there's a lot more houses than there are skyscrapers. Now that you have some more context for the issue of collisions as a whole, I want to give you some information that shaped my research question. When we observe animals interact with the world, it's only natural to assume that they're experiencing the world the same way we are, but that's our human bias at play. That's not necessarily true. So it's really important to understand how a particular animal is perceiving the world, and that will help us make more accurate interpretations of their behavior. So in terms of bird vision, it's actually pretty similar to human vision when it comes to which colors we can see and how well we can see, with a couple notable exceptions like hawks and eagles and falcons. They can see a lot better than us, but the average songbird really can't. The major difference comes into play with eye placement. Their eyes are placed on the sides of their head. So because of that, they only have a very small amount of frontal binocular vision, which is mostly what we have. And that binocular vision is in their periphery. Their best vision is out to the sides. And that's because, from an evolutionary perspective, when a bird's flying around, they want to be looking out for potential predators and looking for foraging opportunities, looking for things to eat. You might be able to see why this is an issue when it comes to collisions with structures. It would be kind of like if you were driving a car and trying to watch the road while you were also looking at the side window. So it starts to make a little more sense why they run into things like cell towers and wind turbines, which seem obvious to us, but it's not necessarily obvious to the birds. Birds appear to have trouble perceiving glass as a barrier. And we don't know for sure exactly what they're seeing or what they're experiencing. But at this point, we assume that reflections appear like more habitat or more space that they can fly into, and clear glass might as well not be there. We already have a number of strategies for preventing collisions, but it really varies with how well each method is studied and how cost effective and practical each method is. But I'll give a brief overview of each, just so you all understand what's out there. The first is window films, like you see here. This is a pretty good option for retrofitting buildings. It can be expensive, but the design on the film is thought to break up the reflection and help birds avoid it. Frit glass works in a similar way, but this is something that would be installed as a new building is being constructed. This is a special type of glass that has ceramic embedded in between layers. And an added bonus to this is that it saves on heating and air conditioning costs, as well as being bird safe. A popular DIY option is a physical barrier like paracord or netting. There are products on the market that do the same thing, but a lot of people just set this up for themselves. Some other strategies on other kind of structures include high contrast design. You see here on this windmill, one blade is painted a darker color, And interestingly, just by doing that, that seems to help birds avoid the windmill fairly well. Lastly is a auditory signal, something that my advisor, John Swaddle, developed called an acoustic lighthouse. And this is a conspicuous or obvious sound. And the idea is that it draws a bird's attention forward, where they're typically not looking, and helps them see the structure and avoid it. The auditory signal stood out to me because it seems to operate in a different way than a lot of the other signals. So I began to wonder if it could help in a window collision situation because this was used more for freestanding structures. Specifically, I wanted to know if adding the sound would make a window treatment more noticeable, which led to my research question. Is a multimodal approach more effective at preventing bird collisions with windows? Multimodal is a term that means engaging with more than one sense. In this case, it would be vision and hearing in the form of the window film and the auditory signal. My hypothesis is that using cues that tap into multiple sensory systems will increase the likelihood that birds will notice them and, as a result, avoid collisions more often. To address my research question, I will use a total of 4 treatment groups. The visual treatment will consist of standard household windows with a window film applied. The sound treatment will include those same windows without the window film and a sound playing. The multimodal treatment will include both the window film and the sound, and the control treatment will have neither, just the windows by themselves. The visual cue I chose was a window film. I chose this because they're so popular as a retrofit solution. This film in particular is endorsed by the American Bird Conservancy. Also, I found it to be aesthetically pleasing because for this sort of solution to be practical, people have to like how it looks. Also, buildings where this particular film has been installed have reported a significant reduction in collisions. Based on previous research by a former graduate student, I chose a 4 to 6 kilohertz oscillating frequency as my sound signal. It sounds like this. I chose this frequency in particular because it is one that birds are relatively sensitive to. In this figure here, the x-axis has frequency in kilohertz. You can think of this as the pitch of the sound. On the y-axis is the absolute threshold. That is the quietest the sound can be and still have the listener be able to hear it. So the lower the line, the more sensitive the listener is to that given frequency. But if you'll notice, the 4 to 6 is not actually at the peak sensitivity for birds. This is because during flight, noise is generated, and that noise happens to be in the prime most sensitive range. So to avoid flight noise interfering with my sound signal, I opted for a higher frequency. To transmit the sound signal, I will be using a parametric or directional speaker. This is because the sound in question is not exactly a pleasant one, so I want to eliminate as much noise pollution as possible. The actual flight tunnel consists of a large netted-in area. To the left, you see a smaller enclosed portion of the tunnel, and this is where the bird is released from. The idea is that the bird flies towards the light and then encounters the structure that's lit by ambient daylight. The structure is represented by the smaller gray rectangle, and in front of it is a mist net. This is to both catch the bird and protect it from actually colliding with the structure. Each flight is filmed from multiple angles so it can be digitized later for analysis. This is a photo of my structure. The wooden frame supports 2 windows, and the speaker at the base transmits the sound signal for relevant treatments. The net is there in front of the structure, but I wouldn't be surprised if you can't really see it. But that's a good thing because we don't want the birds to see it either. This photo is a view looking from the other direction, where you see the dark portion of the tunnel. The 3 stars indicate the different cameras I used to film the flights, and the panel with the fake greenery is there to hopefully make the reflections in the window a little more enticing to the bird. This is a short video of what running one of these trials actually looks like. You see there, I'm showing the whiteboard to each of the cameras. This whiteboard has the ID number of the bird, as well as the date and the treatment. At this point, I go into the tunnel with the bird and release it, and shortly you will see it fly at the structure and, well, almost get caught in the net. The digitizing process is a tedious one. For each camera view of each flight, I have to go through and click on the bird frame by frame, but it's well worth the effort because this allows us to know the speed and direction of the bird at any point in its flight. The first thing I'll do with these videos is to go through and try to determine whether the bird would have collided or avoided the structure if the net weren't there. Secondly, I'll go through and do a qualitative analysis where I'll describe the flights in more detail. For example, I'll determine if it would have been a direct collision, if they avoided the structure early, or if they avoided the structure late. Lastly, I'll use the digitized videos to look at the velocity of the birds during their flight. This will allow me to understand each trial in greater detail. At this point, all flights are complete, and I'm still in the long process of digitizing the videos. After that, I'll go on to the analysis. Next, I'll share my predictions with you. This figure is what I would expect if my hypothesis is right. You see the highest proportion of collisions in the control treatment, a significant and about equal reduction in the visual and audio treatments, and a slightly greater reduction of collisions in the multimodal treatment. At this point, you're probably wondering how I can actually use my results to help birds in the real world. When it comes to implementing any kind of collision mitigation strategy, there are 2 important things to keep in mind. Firstly, collisions do not occur randomly. Bird window collisions are highly correlated with area of glass as well as proximity to green space. Secondly, retrofit solutions are not cheap. With these 2 things in mind, a reasonable approach would be to target high mortality areas with the most effective anti-collision strategies. And the results of my study will help us to understand which strategies are the most effective. This graph is based on data that I collected when studying window collisions in downtown Cleveland. The x-axis on the bottom represents number of collisions during one fall migration season, and on the y-axis you have the addresses of various buildings. As you can see, the majority of collisions are actually occurring at only a handful of buildings. If effective anti-collision measures were installed at only the top building, it would reduce collisions in the city overall by over 10%. So if there are 3 things that I want you to remember from today's talk, it's this 3. Firstly, collisions are a major source of bird death. Climate change and habitat loss are undoubtedly major drivers, but those are not issues that we can fix right now. Issues like collisions, on the other hand, we can address. We can't assume that birds are seeing the world the exact same way that we are. So if we understand how their senses work, that will help us to help them. Lastly, more research is needed. We have some products that seem like they work, but there's not a lot of rigorous testing in the field, and we're relying on a lot of anecdotal evidence. Additionally, most collisions are occurring at low-rise and residential buildings. This means that the end users for these products are not building managers, it's regular people like you. Therefore, mitigation strategies have to be user-friendly and practical for the average person. So, what can you do to help save birds from window collisions? Well, firstly, and maybe most obviously, if you have any troublesome windows at your house, see what you can do to bird-proof them. There's a lot of great resources online, and there might be a product that's just right for you in your window. Secondly, move bird feeders closer to the window. This may be counterintuitive, but it reduces the amount of speed that a bird can build up. If you see a bird that's just hit a window and it's merely stunned, the best thing you can do is keep an eye on it. Usually within a few minutes, they'll recover and fly away. If not, the next step, if you're able, is to put it in a small box or brown paper bag and let it rest for an hour or two in a safe place. Hopefully, then at that point, it will fly away. After that, the only person that can help is a wildlife rehabber. Lastly, and most importantly, spread awareness about this issue and advocate for bird-friendly practices. Thank you so much for your attention. At this point, I'll be taking questions.